Hey guys, Fox here, and today it is time to do the top 5 worst original USFL franchises. Now, the original USFL, of course, from the 80s. This is now a part 2, as last week I did the top 5 best franchises. You can click the eye icon at the top right of this video to go check it out if you haven't already. But this is essentially part 2 of that video that I said I was going to do. Now, just like last week, we are looking at the franchises as their overall success, or in this time, their non-successes in things like win-losses, playoff success, attendance, and notable people. How did certain players and coaches end up doing in the NFL or other leagues? How well was their attendance compared to the other teams of the league? And overall survivability and all that. So just like last time, it isn't just going to be about wins and losses. That makes it too easy, and that doesn't really show the overall success a franchise had in everything considered. So there is going to be some potential hot takes here, but honestly in this list, I think this was easier to make than the top 5 best. Whereas the top 5 best, there were teams that just kind of missed out being on that list on the bubble. This one really felt like it was pretty clear who the 5 worst teams are. It's just a matter of how do you order them, especially the top 2 are pretty tough. But without further ado, let's get started with number 5, the Breakers. Now, the Breakers, I can't even really call them by a team name because they played in 3 different cities. Now, it is 100% understandable why this happened. They played in Boston their first year. It was a terrible stadium and everything, so they moved to New Orleans. Then, of course, before the 85 season started, they voted to play the 86 season in fall, so they preactively moved, like many other teams did, moved to Portland. So it is fully understandable why they did play in 3 different cities, but at the end of the day, you still have to view it as they played in 3 different cities. They weren't able to get a better stadium in the Boston area, and their attendance was still pretty poor. All in all, not terrible, especially in 84. New Orleans was actually solid 30K in an 18-team league. But their 7 and 85 was middle of the pack, and they had sub 20K, which isn't good. And of course, their first year in Boston was the worst in attendance of the entire league. Now, they did have some notable people, which is what really does save them from going to the top 4 in this list. Of course, you have their QB, Johnny Walton, but they have other guys, a couple big famous running backs. Dick Curry is their coach, and of course, a few other guys on their team that were really solid, like tight end Dan Ross. And their overall success as a team, their best year was, ironically, the year they had almost nobody show up to their games. Their first year, they went 11-7, but they missed the playoffs. And they finished with a 25-29 record, which isn't great, but isn't the worst in the league. The fact is, the Breakers, I feel like 5 is a very easy spot for them. I think it's pretty difficult to pick any team that I don't have on this list as being a worse franchise than them. And I also think it's almost impossible to put the Breakers any higher on this list. 5 seems to be that kind of middle ground spot for them, where it's pretty clear they're worse than all the franchises not on this list, but they're better than all the ones that are higher up on this list. Because again, this team did have famous people. This team did have at least 1 year of really good attendance. It's just that they still kind of are lagging in other areas, especially overall team success. Not making the playoffs a single time is a big deal, and they don't have any benefits that other teams that could have made this list do in that regard. So because of that, I think the Breakers have to be number 5. I think that yes, a lot of people nowadays might be shocked at this because, the New Orleans Breakers were a big famous team in the new USFL despite never playing in New Orleans. When you're talking about the original league, the Breakers have very famous players, no doubt. But their overall lack of team success, the fact that they did play in 3 different cities and only had 1 year of actual good attendance, their complete change in ownership basically every time to some degree. There's just a lot of issues that as a franchise don't make them look very successful. Again, the famous players they had is the benefit they have above a lot of other teams on this list. But I don't think that it's enough because we're not talking about players like a Doug Flutie or Herschel Walker where they're just, they transcend the USFL in a sense. Whereas these ones, yes, some of these guys were really good players in the NFL or legends in college, but all in all, I think that 5 is a good spot for them. Their lack of team success, their lack of overall attendance from 2 of the 3 years, their ownership turmoil that changed every year to some degree. Number 5 is a good spot for them. Now, number 4 is going to be the Outlaws. Now, the Outlaws are one of those weirder ones with their whole merger with the Arizona Wranglers, but essentially they are the ones that technically did survive of the 2 of them in a sense. Now, the Outlaws come in at number 4. Their attendance both years was not great. 14 out of 18 teams the first year, and they were 9th in 85, which was not great, and that was on the lower bottom 5-ish of the league, or bottom 6. 17.8K, not great. 21,000 is not terrible, but 14th in the league. Because especially in 84, the attendance as a whole was a lot better, as we just mentioned how the Breakers had, almost 20K, yet were 7th in 85. 20K in 84 was definitely not the best you wanted. Now, again, the Outlaws did not make the playoffs in either year. Whether they were in Oklahoma or Arizona, they did not make the postseason. Their 14-22 record was not great. Now, they did have Doug Williams, which is, of course, the most famous person on the whole team. And they had a couple other ones, a couple famous coaches, mainly Frank Kush. But all in all, this team, I feel like 4 is a good spot for them as well. Their attendance was not great. It was not even really mediocre. It was basically poor. Not terrible, but poor. And they, again, did not have any postseason success. And they're lacking in the overall famous people area compared to other teams, especially teams that did miss out on this list and all that. I think the 4 is a very solid spot for them. I think it's pretty hard. Again, this is another one of those teams where it's pretty difficult to try and move them to another degree. So number 4 is where I'm going to sit them. Now, number 3 is going to be the Gunslingers. The San Antonio Gunslingers are a team a lot of people do want to see back that are USFL fans because, of course, nowadays we know San Antonio can be a great place for football, but of course they have the Brahmas. The main point, though, with the San Antonio Gunslingers is that I don't really care what they did in the AFA. Look, I was talking about a comment earlier today when I'm recording this, about how the Stallions are supposed to be viewed as the best team in the modern UFL despite only having one UFL season. And I said it's because the USFL was basically the same competition. The AFA was not the same competition. The reason nobody talks about it is because it was, in all sense, a minor football league. So yes, the Gunslingers, believe it or not, did actually exist prior to the USFL in the AFA under different team names, of course. But I don't care what they did in that league because that same team that went to the USFL in the more major football league immediately proved the difference. They went 7-11 the first year in '84 and missed the playoffs, then went 5-13 in '85 and missed the playoffs. Their attendance was even worse than either team we've talked about before, as 15th and 13th is horrid. 15K attendance and then 11K attendance is terrible. And in terms of famous, they really are lacking there as well. I mean, they didn't have a super famous QB. They didn't have the most famous coaching group. And then, Danny Bugs was their best, most famous receiver, really. It just, as an overall team, this was not a memorable team. They had a couple things, but they had a couple things that were memorable. And, of course, one of those couple of things was the fact that this team was really broke. I mean, granted, because the '86 season never happened, it really didn't matter, but they had the only team that had an owner that straight up got his team revoked because of the fact that he just didn't pay his players because he couldn't. So you had a lot of issues there and all that. It's just, there was a lot of negative things about him. And yes, there were a couple of famous things, but when one of those famous things is just how broke they were at the end, that's not good. And again, I understand they were a very successful team in the AFA. They did win a championship going undefeated, but that was a minor football league. It's why nobody really talks about it and nobody remembers it. And a lot of you probably don't even know that league existed or that the Gunslingers came from that league. But that is how it was. And so since that's not like the modern USFL and XFL, which have very similar, if not the exact same talent pool as the UFL, this was a minor football league that had a team that went to the pro football league of the USFL, and it showed. They were not as good a team as you expected if you were an AFA fan. So because of that, and because of their overall lack of USFL success, their awful attendance in the USFL, their lack of famous people, they're third. But believe it or not, this wasn't even like a close for second. They are somehow far better than number 2 because number 2 is going to be the Federals/Renegades. Now, as I talked about in the last one, I view that if you are the franchise that overall survives, changes, and moves and all that, it's overall what you've done. So the Renegades, which benefits this team immensely. If you take out their time as the Renegades, this team is number 1. Okay, their 2 years as the Federals, they had 7 wins. That's it, 7 wins. And you have to take away their most famous overall person on their team in Lee Corso, who was there in '85. Yes, they still had Craig James, which is famous, but again, and Ray Yock was, CFL guy, but overall, you take away their most famous person in Lee Corso, you take away their best season, which again is only 5-13, but still, and their best season in attendance, which was actually respectable 24K in '85. But their attendance in '83 and '84 in the USFL was horrific. They were second to worst in both years. They had sub 8,000 attendance in '84, which is unbelievably terrible. Remember, that's worse than like modern UFL teams are doing, and the modern UFL's number one criticism is how poor their attendance is overall. So when you think about that, you realize just how bad that is for attendance back then. So yes, I put them at number 2. The Renegades do save them a lot because their team did get slightly better in '85. They did get a famous head coach. They did see their attendance actually became a somewhat respectable number in Orlando. If you just keep them as the Federals, it's pretty easy to put them at number 1. But for me, I think that number 2 is a very good spot for them because the team at number 1 is just infamously bad in terms of the fact that it was just super unmemorable and all that. But the Federals, I could totally buy an argument for them being number one. I think that number one, number two in this list are very obvious. It's the two teams that are clearly the two worst franchises in the OG USFL. It's just a matter of how you rank them. But for me, number one, the worst team is the Pittsburgh Maulers. Here's why. When the new USFL announced the 8 teams that were going to be in this league, one team did not feel like the rest, the Maulers. That was the team where people said, who? Because the Maulers existed for one season in '84. They did not merge with another team. They did not, join forces with another team. They didn't, like the Panthers, how, they basically merged with the Invaders but were the Invaders. They weren't like that. They existed for 1 year and then went away. They're the only team to do that. That's it. They're the only team to have no connection to any other franchise, city, or whatever after the '84 season. And that '84 season had them go 3-15. So their one season they played was terrible, and their attendance itself also, that actually isn't how good their attendance really was. The attendance was heavily boosted by their game against the Birmingham Stallions, the whole Cliff Stout situation with Pittsburgh fans hating him and all that, where they basically packed the stadium to hate on him. So if you eliminate that opening game, their attendance drops a couple of thousand. So their attendance wasn't even as good as that says, and even then, that 23 almost 1,000 still is only 13th of 18 teams, but that would have been far worse if you didn't have that one anomaly. And in terms of famous people and all that, you really just have Mike Rozier. That was your most famous person. And granted, he's a Heisman Trophy winner. But when you look at Mike Rozier, the Heisman Trophy winner before and after him, they were Herschel Walker and Doug Flutie, who both were far more famous Heisman Trophy winners. So your most famous person was the least famous of a trio that should have been super famous but really weren't because he was the least of the three. Still a great player, but, not the same. They didn't have the most famous of team around him. They were a terrible team themselves. Their attendance wasn't good, and then when you eliminate their week one opener that had that obscene attendance that was only because of Cliff Stout, you realize that their attendance was even worse than what it says. And the fact that they only existed 1 year and didn't even go with another team, that's really bad. I find it hard to put this team at 2, personally. Again, if you only count the Federals as the Federals and not the Renegades, even though they were the same team and all that, I could buy it because the Federals had 2 seasons of even worse attendance and a team that was basically as bad. But again, like I said, for me, I think that this team is number 1. They were so forgettable that when they came back in the modern era, it was like a whoa. And I mean, they even changed the color scheme in the second year of the modern USFL. Yes, it was to accommodate to all the, black and gold teams in Pittsburgh, but the fact they didn't even keep the history because the history was just so bad in a sense, it says something. So all in all, I think the Maulers do have to be number 1. Again, I could totally buy an argument for them moving to number 2, but I don't see it. So overall, that'll do it for this list. Again, like I said, I think it's pretty hard to put any other teams on this list. I know some might say the Blitz, their attendance wasn't great, but they did make the playoffs, and their whole weird trade situation with their teams and all that kind of led to them kind of getting to the 84 championship in a sense where their players did after they traded them. Not the Blitz, but the Blitz players from 83. The point is, they at least made the playoffs and have some connection to a team that made it to a championship. Then other teams, like the Express, they had multiple Hall of Famers, and so did the Blitz. So I think that other teams that you could make a case for immediately lose out on that case because they had postseason success. The Express were a part of 2 of the most famous non-championship games in USFL history. The Blitz had 2 Hall of Fame coaches. Whereas these 5 teams, there's really nothing that makes them even arguable to not be in this top 5. So that's how I view it. Let me know what your list is down below. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. We're on the way to 900 subscribers. And hopefully we can hit that soon. Maybe hit 1,000 by the end of the year. We'll see. And as always, guys, have a great night.